Welcome, everyone. I want to invite you to join us today for the next hour on our session topic, which is supporting equity and diversity in seniors housing. We have two speakers. Our first will be Dr. Soonji who's a researcher at the Wellesley Institute in Toronto, Ontario. And we have Roger Myers, who is the president and CEO for Presbyterian Villages of Michigan in Southfield, Michigan, USA. So again, we're continuing our aim of this conference to have a cross-national exchange. We welcome questions in the Q&A. Go ahead and share resources in the chat also. And my name is Tam Perry. I'm one of the conference organizers. Happy to chime in if there are questions later. And I'm going to just turn it over to Soonji now. Thank you to both presenters for speaking too.
So hello, everyone. Let me just share my screen.
Hi there, Soonji. Just to confirm, if you can just press display settings and swap those. Okay, we see your slide. Thank you.
Okay, so let me begin my presentation in a second. I have two monitors. I'm just trying to figure out the layout. So does it? Okay, so maybe this doesn't. Does it work?
Right now, we are seeing your full slides. We were for a second just seeing your presenter's notes, but not anymore, so we're good.
Okay, good to go. So hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to our session that focuses on equity and diversity in seniors housing. I'll be focusing on support needs of seniors with limited English proficiency who live in Toronto's social housing. Let me see why mine. Okay. I will begin by introducing my organization and myself. So Wellesley Institute is a health think tank in Toronto, and we work in research and policy to improve health and health equity through action on the social determinants of health. I have been leading a research program on seniors, aging, and equity. And here's a list of our recent publications. And I have been focusing on older adults' access to home and community care and long-term care and other government-funded services and resources. And that's how I became into the field of social housing that supports low-income seniors living in Toronto. And I hope that you can visit our website and read some of our reports if interested. They are all available on our website. And in this and next slides, I would like to spend a little bit of time to talk about health equity and what it means to people with limited English proficiency, particularly. Some of you might be very familiar with this term and others might not, but conceptually, according to the WHO's definition, health equity means that all people can reach their full health potential and should not be disadvantaged from attaining it because of their race, ethnicity, religion, gender, age, social class, and any other socioeconomic status. And in understanding this concept, it is important to recognize the difference between equality and equity, as well presented in this image that I'm sharing with you today. And this image was developed by Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And equality is basically providing the same level of support and assistance to all segments of society. And in comparison, equity is providing various levels of support that is tailored to the needs of diverse population groups and depending on the specific needs and abilities. So what does this mean for seniors with limited English proficiency? So there is a growing body of research evidence that indicates significant inequities for those with limited English proficiency in accessing needed supports such as home care and long-term care, as well as health care services. And also, in one of our research projects, we found significant disparities in health outcomes between seniors with English mother tongue and those with non-English mother tongue. My colleagues at Wellesley Institute conducted a scoping review of the literature that focuses on the effectiveness of language supports in improving health outcomes, and found that language interpretation services, for example, and especially the ones by trained interpreters, were very effective in improving clinical and patient outcomes. With all of this, we wanted to bring our health equity lens into a large team project on senior tenants living in Toronto's social housing. This qualitative study, which I will be presenting in more details shortly, focused on the language barriers experienced by senior tenants living in Toronto's social housing. I will first introduce our project team. This study was conducted as part of a large collaborative project on supporting the integrated service model for seniors housing, which was funded by Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. And the co-PIs of this project is Dr. Sander Hitchik of Sunnybrook Research Institute and Andrea Austin of the City of Toronto, and Dr. Christine Shepard and Sarah Gould at the Sunnybrook Research Institute, and my research team at the Wellesley Institute, including Dr. Brenda Roche, myself, and Charmika Satyamurthy have been working together to focus on support needs to address language barriers as our first mini project, and also the support needs to address to improve eviction prevention support as our second project. So to give you a bit of background on the seniors living in Toronto community housing buildings, which is the largest social housing provider in Canada. This slide presents some like a high-level summary of the people living in TCHC buildings. So overall, over 28,000 seniors, 59 years and older, live in TCHC buildings, and half of them live in one of the 83 seniors designated buildings. And they are mainly low-income seniors, and many face challenges including poor health, mobility issues, social isolation, and cognitive impairment that are often intersected with other experiences such as racialized and gender-based poverty, racism, and unequal access to supports. And for tenants not speaking English fluently, our study team assumed that language barriers could add another layer of complexity in accessing supports they need to age in place. So we started this study with two specific objectives. The first one is to identify main language barriers experienced by senior tenants in accessing support to age in place. And also based on our research findings, we were aiming to provide suggestions to address identified language barriers, particularly to inform the city's work on implementing a new housing services model to better support seniors successfully maintain their tenancy and age in social housing with dignity, comfort, and support. For this study, we used qualitative research methods. So we conducted qualitative interviews, in-person interviews, and focus groups with 58 senior tenants living in Toronto community housing buildings, including many English-speaking tenants, as well as 14 Chinese-speaking tenants and 3 Tamil-speaking tenants. We also heard from 58 professionals supporting senior tenants in Toronto's community housing buildings, who represent 17 different agencies from a variety of sectors, including community support services, primary care, and housing. We also received quantitative data that speak to the tenant's language profile from the TCHC. So we conducted a descriptive analysis of tenants' language data. And for the qualitative data analysis, we used the thematic data analysis methods to find the commonalities and uniqueness of experiences and perspectives across different groups of tenants and professionals. So this slide presents the linguistic diversity of senior tenants. Among the 13,000 tenants living in seniors designated buildings, we found that 44% indicated speaking non-English language. And the graphs here in this slide presents the top 10 languages spoken by tenants, including Cantonese, Russian, Mandarin, Spanish, and other languages, which speaks to the diversity of senior tenants. And we, through our data analysis of our interviews and focus groups, we identified 4 main barriers to access needed supports for tenants living in the CHC buildings. The first main barrier we identified was accessing barriers to access information about housing. The first sub-theme was about information access about the building. So tenants were reporting that access to housing information affecting their daily life is super critical, but at the same time, they found that notices and announcements and talks are mostly delivered only in English. And this quote is from a Mandarin-speaking tenant. Quote, sometimes they would send us notices about things like water or power outage, but they are all in English. Most of the people living here are Chinese old ladies, just like the PA announcements. We don't understand. So this tenant was showing her frustration over English-only messages because she couldn't understand. And also, tenants talked about their challenges when dealing with tenancy-related matters, such as filling out annual review forms, submitting required documents, and following up with housing staff about their rent payment, and any other housing-related matters. There was so the first quote is from a care coordinator who was speaking about her experience of supporting her client who was Russian speaking and living in TCHC building. Quote, there was a sign next to the elevator about completing your annual review because someone is coming. But if you can't read English, how would you know this review was being done today? So the Russian speaking tenant that this care coordinator was supporting was not able to fill out the form as there was no adequate support for interpretation or translation so that he could understand the messages delivered by letter from the housing office. And the second quote is from a Mandarin-speaking tenant who also talked about his frustration about English-only documents. Quote, because the lease is in English, we can't read it. I don't understand anything they send us. Sometimes that does hold things up. And our interview participants also talked about limited access to formal interpretation and translation support. And also, it was really difficult for them to find a bilingual staff who can communicate in a language tenants speak. And that created communication challenges between staff and tenants. And this quote is from another Mandarin-speaking tenant who talked about the lack of access to bilingual staff. Quote, on the first Tuesday of every month, somebody from management would come to the building to deal with the problems old people have. The problem is that she speaks English. We Chinese have no way to communicate with her. So this tenant was excited to hear that there will be someone coming to help the senior tenants, and so when he went to the meeting, but he just disappointed that like there was no way to communicate with the staff, and he wanted to speak to the staff to apply for a parking spot in their building, but simply there was no way to communicate. And so in many cases, tenants who experience communication barriers, they often sought help from their informal networks. Often it is like there are other children who live nearby or their bilingual neighbors who can bridge the language gap. However, many tenants and also professionals reported that such informal support often came with challenges, as presented in the quotes presented here. The first quote is from the Mandarin-speaking tenant who was talking about his failure to speak directly with the staff about the parking spot. So this tenant asked his bilingual tenant to phone the housing office to apply for a parking spot on their behalf. But it also came with the challenges. Quote, we have to bother other people to help us, but this neighbor is really nice. He's a great help to the Chinese here. His English is very good, but his Chinese is a lot of times he fails to convey his ideas correctly. So our communication still doesn't go very smoothly. The second quote is from a bilingual male tenant who has lived in the seniors building with his Cantonese-speaking mother. Quote, a lot of seniors live by themselves and have language barriers. It would be best if their families can help them, but I know a lot of them don't have such luxury. So our interview participants talked about more proactive, more effective language support for people living in social housing. The last theme we identified was access barriers to healthcare and other community supports. And our participants reported that language barriers significantly affected the seniors' use of health services and other community supports. This is a quote from a supportive housing staff. Quote, and they need to fix that, the lack of communication support, because my Korean client does not want to go to the hospital because she says when she goes there, there's nobody to follow her. They just put her in a corner and nobody talks to her because they don't speak Korean. So through our interviews and focus groups, we heard that these language barriers are making senior tenants feel frustrated, excluded, and disempowered. And they made senior tenants feel concerned about their safety around the building, because when they could not understand the announcement, which sounded like an emergency situation, then that made them worry about their safety and well-being. And as presented in the previous slide, those barriers also discourage senior tenants from using available healthcare and other supports. So based on what we heard from interviews and focus groups, we have come up with this list of recommendations. For the sake of the time, I'll provide a very quick high-level summary of our recommendations for improving supports for senior tenants with limited English proficiency. So the first recommendation is around enhancing data collection and utilization of tenants' language of preference. Second one is around developing strategies to provide proactive, effective language success services. Third is around providing enhanced staff training about available resources to support seniors with limited English proficiency, and also potentially culturally and linguistically appropriate staff training. And the next one is around proactively sharing information in the language tenants speak. And lastly, but also very importantly, facilitate engagement with senior tenants with limited English proficiency in the service monitoring and evaluations. To end my presentation, I would like to share this image that we created from our previous home and community care project for diverse seniors and family caregivers. At the beginning, I talked about health equity approach and why it is important to bring that lens to our work in supporting seniors living in social housing. With our study findings, I would like to highlight that again. To improve health and housing experiences of all senior tenants, whether they are in social housing or other places, it is important to incorporate that lens and understand the diverse experiences of senior tenants, and also to improve the services and supports to reflect the diversity and address any barriers that exist to access supports that are designed to help seniors age in place. And I will end my presentation here, but I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts, comments, and any questions you have. And also, I'm particularly interested in hearing your own experiences or any strategies that you think helpful in supporting seniors with limited English proficiency in other jurisdictions or other similar or different settings, so that we can learn from each other. So thank you very much once again. Our staff share.
Thank you so much, Sunji. It was an excellent presentation, and it really gives us a lot to think about how to make the environment of one's home to be sort of places of inclusion. So thank you. I'm going to now turn it over to Roger Myers, and then we'll get together for Q&A at the end. So please add any questions and keep your thoughts and comments. We would love to hear them. Turn it over to you, Roger.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Perry. Appreciate it very much. And good afternoon to all of our colleagues from across Canada and the US and perhaps other countries. Pleased to be with you today. Dr. Perry had asked me to share a little bit of how I ended up in the senior living aging services field. Started off in healthcare out of graduate school, was working at a small community hospital, and ultimately became an assistant administrator there. And after a couple of years, I was recruited by a large senior living organization by the name of the United Methodist Retirement Communities based in Michigan, and offered the position to be executive director of one of their retirement communities in the city of Detroit. And even though I had no experience in senior housing or aging services, I accepted the position, and really that was very pivotal in changing my career. Even though what we do is still partly healthcare, I've been largely in aging services and senior living ever since. So, and this was back in the late 1970s and early 80s. What I'm going to share with you is about the journey that Presbyterian Villages of Michigan, and we use the acronym PVM, Presbyterian Villages of Michigan, our journey with regard to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. For a long while, we just referred to it as D&I work. But in the past year, we've added the important word of equity as well as justice or social justice. If you can go to the next slide, please. A bit of background on PVM. We were started in the early 1940s. As the name would imply, we were started by the Presbyterian Church, a component of the church called the Presbytery of Detroit, so in southeast Michigan, back in the 1930s, began studying the development of a organization that would serve older Presbyterians. And in 1945, our first community opened just outside of the city of Detroit. So it was very much an initiative of the Presbyterian Church for its older members. It was not a broad community initiative. It wasn't initially involved in serving the larger community. It was very inward focused. But through the decades that followed, the organization evolved and expanded its services, probably most notably in the mid-1970s. The organization developed its first affordable senior housing development in the city of Pontiac. So prior to that point, we had one location. It was essentially all market rate, just outside of the city of Detroit. And I'm sure at that time, all of the residents that were served were white and were middle to upper income individuals. And probably 70 to 80% of those individuals were Presbyterians. Again, nothing wrong with the Presbyterians, but it was definitely not a diverse organization. But beginning with our development in Pontiac, again, affordable housing for low to moderate income, the organization began its journey to becoming much, much more diverse. Then through the 80s, there were a couple more locations that were developed. One that was mostly market rate, a fourth that was affordable housing, and then a fifth that was, I would say, mixed income. Flash forward to today, we have 35 locations across the lower peninsula of Michigan. We haven't yet developed a program service or housing in the Upper Peninsula, but that is certainly one of our goals. And we serve in the most densely urban areas that you can find in Michigan. We serve the suburban communities, the outstate kind of medium-sized cities. We serve in rural areas, and we serve in what we would call resort areas. We also, in addition to communities where older people live, again, from very low income to middle income to higher income, we've become very involved in home and community-based services. We know that if you ask, I think this is true probably anywhere in the world, but if you ask a group of seniors, where would you like to live? They would generally tell you in pretty high percentages, I just would like to live in my own home, my own apartment, my own condo, in my own community. Thank you very much. I'm not really that interested in moving to a senior community, no matter how good it is. So home and community-based services has become a big focus for us. And one of the biggest ways that we do that is through a program called PACE. PACE stands for Program of All-Inclusive Care for the Elderly. And it's a terrific program. It combines elements of a health plan or an insurance company and a healthcare delivery system. And we may come back to that a little bit more if we have some time. Let's go to the next slide, please. In 2013, the PVM board adopted this organizational commitment statement around diversity and inclusion. and you can read this on your own. Basically, we wanted to have the board adopt a position that we would use for enhancing our business case. And instead of having something in our beliefs and values statement about how we would not discriminate, treat people fair, equitably, equally, we developed a statement of diversity and inclusion. And this was coming after probably a 20-year journey where, beginning in the mid 90s, PVM went from having really very little diversity, even though, as I indicated, in the 70s, we began serving people of different economic means. It was still not a very diverse organization. And then through the efforts of the Reverend Dr. Lawrence T. Glenn Sr., things really changed. Let's go to the next slide, and let's play the first minute of this video or so. I want to introduce you to the Reverend Dr. Lawrence Glenn. Christian, we can drop the video now. I wanted to share the image of Dr. Glenn and his words, again, because of our deep gratitude and respect for the role that he played with PVM. So I think it was 1993 1993, Dr. Glenn joined the board of directors for Presbyterian Villages of Michigan. And the board was discussing at one meeting about developing a new community. And they were talking about different cities across the state, and we could locate here, we could locate there. And Dr. Glenn raised his hand and he asked the question, how committed are we to serving the community? And the board members, all of them said, well, yes, of course, that's what we do. We're here to serve the community. And then they proceeded to talk about serving here, serving there around the state. And Dr. Glenn raised his hand a second time and he said, let me be very specific. What about Detroit? And there was a moment of silence. It felt like maybe it was 30 seconds, maybe it was only 10 seconds. And the board members began to say, well, Dr. Glenn, yep, that's a good idea. We should do that. Keep in mind, the organization that had existed since the 40s had no presence in the city of Detroit, the largest city in Michigan, one of the largest cities in the country, of the U.S. And so that began our journey. In fact, Dr. Glenn was asked to chair the task force that led us to developing our first senior living community in the city of Detroit. So that was, again, mid-90s. So fast forward to 2021, we have more locations, more communities, more services, more programs, serve more people in the city of Detroit than anywhere else in the state. And I mean, I'd like to think that we would have done it regardless, but it does, to me, point out the importance of one question, even if it has to be asked twice. And so we give a lot of respect and credit to Dr. Glenn, who has recently passed on, for having the courage to ask the question and to push our organization forward. And as a result of that, our organization has become extraordinarily diverse, especially with regard to race, as well as religions and a variety of other characteristics. And we thought we were making great headway. Again, it's a journey that never ends. And then last summer, unfortunately, with all of the strife, the civil unrest, starting with, I think many would say, starting with the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and then continuing with many other incidents across the country, across the U.S. and other parts of the world, recognizing and lifting up, with the political backdrop that was going on as well in this country, in the U.S., just around fundamental inequities relative to race and economic status and the like. So PVM was profiled in some publications, most notably Senior Housing News, that the link on this slide provides you with a story that kind of told the PVM story over the last 30 years. But it caused us to really pause and look inward to say, even though we had done quite a bit, we recognized we had done nowhere near enough. Let's go to the next slide. This is a snapshot of our racial composition of our residents, and this is really only part of our organization. We serve about 10,000 individuals through all of our different programs. But you can see the breakdown of race, primarily between white and Black or African Americans, and it's roughly a little over 40%, almost 41%. Black African Americans, and then 58% white. So not a lot of other races across the organization. Go to the next slide, please. And then we looked at our staff members, and again, good diversity, over 30% Black, African American, and the largest percent still being white, but again, good diversity with regard to race. Go to the next slide. I think this next one is on our board members. And so our board members, and in addition to the system-wide board for PVM, each of our communities, so each of these 30 plus communities around the state and our programs like PACE, each of those entities have their own volunteer board of directors. And so when we add them all up, you see we have almost 250 volunteers that govern these entities, and you can see almost an even split between Black, African American, and white in terms of board membership. This is a huge shift from where we were in the 1980s, where it was almost 100% white. Go to the next slide, please. And you can go to the next one. And so as we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, we look at them not as only noble, worthy, important causes, but we also want to look at it from the business case, and to articulate and develop and maintain a business case for embracing and implementing DEI and J. Next slide, please. And again, we involved the the whole organization, from the board to management to residents and frontline staff, in developing a strong business case around DEI&J. Next slide, please. And spent time defining, and Sunji did some of that in her presentation, what is diversity, what is equity, what's inclusion, what's justice. That middle graphic there is similar to the bicycles that Sunji showed, where, if you said, well, we're all for equality, right? We're all for equality. Everyone looking at the baseball game gets the same box to stand on, regardless of their height. Whereas equity, individuals would get a different size of box, or maybe they'd get two boxes based on their height. Next slide, please. And we developed a diversity and inclusion council. This is a system-wide, it's not really a board, but it's a council that would help guide the efforts around originally D&I, and we're changing the name of the council now to include equity and social justice. And you can see under the leadership of the council, I actually chair the council. We felt it was very important the CEO play a very active and prominent role in that body. Next slide. And then maintaining the business case, and the notion here with all of these diverse inputs into the business case, and creating a strong enough knot to bound everyone in the organization together to achieve the goals of diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice. Next slide. And I'm sure that all of you've read or heard this quote before from Maya Angelou. People will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. Next slide. And then training has been very, very important across our organization at all levels of staff. We have begun to do some education. I wouldn't call it training, but more education and awareness among residents. Next slide, please. And this slide indicates why it's important. Again, a lot of these reasons are obvious, and you have been hearing more about unconscious bias, and part of, in fact, Michigan has just recently, our governor has mandated any licensed healthcare professional, as part of their annual licensing renewal, has got to complete an educational module in implicit and unconscious bias. And because folks would say, well, I'm not prejudiced, I'm not racist, I'm not whatever, but it's really what is more unconscious or implicit that's of need of understanding and addressing and improving. Next slide, please. And this is just one of the models for how we've pursued education and training and development on diversity inclusion. Next slide. And this gives further overview of that model, where we do analysis, design based on the data from the analysis, come up with the content for the program that we're going to implement, and then implementing that program, and then evaluating the effectiveness. We started with this more formalized effort in 2019, and had begun to roll it out. And then, of course, with the pandemic starting now, hard to say this, 17 or 18 months ago, but starting in February and March of 2020, much of our efforts in the training were were paused for obvious reasons, but we are re-engaging that now. Go to the next slide, please. And just some kind of thoughts about where to begin, and not, I would say, not being tentative about it, but being proactive and intentional, and you really need to have leadership support. So whether it's a board of directors or whatever the top governing structure, or if it's ownership of a private company, that it needs to you need to have sign on from the very top, and then really proceed to implement it. And certainly there are resources, consultants that can assist. We have engaged different outside resources, and are actually in the process right now of selecting a firm to work with our board of directors. Next slide, please. And there's some resources that you can look at in the handouts. You can click on those links. Next slide. And again, it's about being intentional and recognizing that this is not a quick process. This is not like you can declare for 2021 you're going to address everything under diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice. Get it all done by the end of the year. This is a never ending journey. Next slide. And a couple of things we're doing actually this summer, starting about a month from now. We're a part of an organization. In fact, one of your speakers is with Leading Age. There's the Summer Enrichment Program, and this is placing interns, largely interns, people of color, and they are placed in these internship positions for 10 weeks in the summer. And PVM has 4 interns that'll be starting with us on June 7th. So we're looking forward to that. Next slide. And again, this DEIJ is something that just has to be continually practiced, assessed, learn from mistakes. It's not going to be perfect. And it needs to be done at as deep a level as possible, and be careful of not just having it be on the surface. Next slide. And then the actually a big part of the internship program is the leadership pipeline. There are really not many individuals in executive leadership positions within the U.S. senior living aging services field that represent people of color or other minority groups. And we need to develop the career ladder. And of course, many of the direct frontline staff are people of color, but you see the disparity as you contrast the direct frontline staff to the folks that are in the corporate offices. Next slide. And it is about moving from the front line to the boardroom. So I'm really pleased that the PVM board of directors, so our system-wide board, is very diverse. Certainly diverse with regard to gender, diverse with regard to race. And I mean, it can always be stronger and better, but certainly when you look at PVM's frontline workforce and they see our board of directors that has half of those board members are people of color, it is a powerful, it's more than a symbol, because it really is how the organization is directed and led. Next slide. And we also are involved in intergenerational programming. So we are starting in the fall at our communities in Flint, a program where occupational and physical therapy students at the University of Michigan in Flint as well as social work students are going to live in our senior housing in Flint. And part of their living with the seniors is an expectation of providing various services and community engagement with the seniors. So that's something we're very, very excited about, and we think that that will probably be replicated across our organization, and not just within the, health fields or social work, but probably in other fields. And I think the next slide, and maybe wrapped up. Okay, so I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Perry, and we can, CJ and I can take questions. Dr. Perry, back to you.
Well, first of all, thanks to you both. I hope Soonji also comes back on, and here she is. I just think it's remarkable that this session really highlighted differences and how to address them, which in a lot of ways, this gives us hope because there's a way we can improve quality beyond sort of thinking about number of beds, number of affordable units, which are also very difficult challenges we faced, and we heard that from the beginning. So, in Soonji's work, sort of thinking about predominant languages of Cantonese, Russian, Mandarin speakers, that was really interesting. I myself today got a question from someone who has a Cantonese speaking relative in Detroit looking for long-term care. So it was interesting that I heard that from you today. And then, Roger really talked about sort of the efforts in a sort of organizational way to increase the number of persons of colors being served by his organization. The other thing we thought we saw was sort of a researcher's perspective and an administrator's perspective. But honestly, the commonalities are both of you raised barriers and access, this idea of both safety and health consequences of barriers, like you can't read the notices, but also these larger issues of inclusion, belonging. What does it mean to make this your home? I'm going to integrate some of the questions. Roger really touched on leadership from his point of view. One of the questions was sort of how do people sort of identify their backgrounds? Is it self-report? Is it sort of how does PVM consider diversity of faiths, maybe even age? And then Soonji, someone in the chat talked about what you raised, which is we need to understand more data about this population, but someone asked about quantitative data, and if you knew of any, could point us to any, in a way that's also a self-report of people's experience. So, what can be known? But I would turn it over to both of you. We have about 5 minutes. So one thing is to think about what you heard in the other person's talk and say, oh, that resonates, or it's a little different in my context. But then also this idea of sort of the importance of leadership in Roger's case, and then Soonji as a researcher, that would also be great. So I'm going to start with Roger first and then end with Soonji. So you'll get the last word. How's that?
Yeah, so we, thanks, Dr. Perry. We really look to the individuals to self-identify, designate their own status, whether it's related to their faith or non-faith or race or sexual orientation, whatever that may be. And we do certainly have a lot of age diversity. We have age diversity on our board. We just actually, in early April, celebrated the 100th birthday of one of our board members, Natalie Brothers. And she's a very active board member. She lives at one of our communities now in Detroit, and has been on the board for a long time. And so we have diversity of age of board members, and certainly the people we serve. We are serving a wide range. We're serving people in their 50s in some of our communities. Probably our average age is someone in their 80s. And so, and with regard to religion, I mentioned our organization started by serving all Presbyterians. Now Presbyterians probably are like 5% of the people we serve. We serve way more Baptist, Catholic, people of other faiths. Presbyterians, again, very small number. Again, not a bad thing. It's just, because we intentionally we went from being inward focused to being outward focused. and that was transformational in so many ways.
All right, thank you, Roger. Sunji, comments?
Okay, so thank you so much for the great comments and questions in the chat box. So first of all, there's one thing that I can point to from Roger's presentation that is different from my experience as a Canadian researcher, is that I was impressed to see the ethnic racial breakdown of the people you are serving in your villages, because that's kind of information is not publicly available, or like it's not easily accessible for researchers in Canada. So, and first of all, we lag behind in terms of the collecting race-based data or any other like socio-demographic data in terms of race, language, ethnicity, and gender identity in terms of diversity measures. So it's not like that goes to the question about that Karen Kobayashi raised about the quantitative data analysis that I have done in terms of in this field. And so that's been a struggle to find the right data that looks, if we want to look at the health equity and health inequities in healthcare or in seniors care, social housing sector, we need a really good data to begin with, but that's something lacking. So in my practice, so we used the most promising data sources is from the C.E.T.S Canada. We have used Canadian Community Health Data Survey data to look at the differences across immigrant versus non-immigrant population and different ethnicity and different language groups. But that also has some limitations. But I can't go into that for the sake of time. But I also want to highlight that there are some promising initiatives in Canada that have been developed in the very recent years. And I think my colleagues just shared news from C.E.T.S Canada today that announced a new investment in developing a better data collection system that look at the race, ethnicity, and gender identity in the upcoming month. So that's something very exciting. But for the current moment, that's something Canada is missing. And for other questions, I think we are out of time, but I hope that if you are interested in, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be happy to have any discussion and make connections in this issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you to everyone coming to our session. I think it's all pushing us. I love the acronyms Roger talked about: diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice. I think that could be a great theme for our session. And also, we hope that you come back to the main room right now. Also, please join us for more interesting talks tomorrow. So I'm going to end our session now. Please click the link that's in the chat browser to get to the main session. See you, everyone.